Have you ever staked your entire future on a promise, pinned all your hopes on the words of a stranger? For Loretta May Thompson, a Boston governess tired of a life in the shadows, a single advertisement in a newspaper was a beacon of hope. It led to letters filled with poetry and passion from a Montana rancher named Jebediah Stone, promising a love as vast as the western sky. She sold everything she owned, traveled 2,000 miles, and stepped onto a dusty platform, ready to meet her soulmate. But the man who greeted her wasn't a poet, and he wasn't alone. What happened next is a story of brutal deception, fierce resilience, and the heart-wrenching truth that sometimes the love you find is born not from a promise, but from the ashes of a lie. The advertisement was modest, almost lost between a notice for patent medicine and another for durable farm equipment. Tucked into the back pages of the Boston Herald in the spring of 1888, it read simply, "Montana widower, landowner, seeks a companion for life's journey. A woman of good character and steady heart, willing to embrace the challenges and beauty of the West. Object matrimony. Address correspondence to J. Stone, Cottonwood Creek, Montana Territory." For Loretta May Thompson, those few lines were a lifeline. At 28, she was firmly on the shelf, a spectre in other people's homes. For a decade, she had served as a governess to the children of Boston's elite, teaching them piano scales they'd forget and French verbs they'd never use. She was respected in a way. She was also invisible. Her life was a collection of quiet footsteps in hallways that were not hers. Meals taken on a tray in her room, and the ache of watching families live a life she could only observe. Her own parents were long gone victims of a fever that swept through their neighborhood when she was a teenager, leaving her with a small inheritance that was now nearly depleted. The prospect of growing old alone, a perpetual guest in a world of families, was a cold, creeping dread that haunted her sleepless nights. This small, unassuming ad was different. It spoke not of romance, but of a journey. It asked for a steady heart, not a pretty face. It was from a place she could only imagine, a place of mountains and vast open land that seemed the very antithesis of her cramped, prescribed existence. With trembling hands, she penned her first letter. She wrote not of her loneliness, but of her skills. She could manage a household, she explained. She was proficient in bookkeeping, could mend any garment, grow a vegetable garden, and possessed a quiet and patient disposition. She presented herself as a capable partner, not a desperate spinster. She signed it, sealed it, and sent it off with a prayer that felt as fragile as the paper it was written on. The reply from Jebediah Stone arrived 6 weeks later, the envelope bearing the smudged postmark of a place that sounded rugged and real. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. The words inside, however, were anything but rugged. "My dearest Miss Thompson, your letter arrived like a spring rain after a long, dry winter. Your candor and capability shine through your words, but it was the spirit behind them that truly captured my attention, a spirit that I sense longs for a bigger sky than the one you currently see. You ask about Montana. It is a land of harsh beauty, a place that demands much but gives back tenfold. The mountains here stand like silent purple kings against the dawn. The creeks run so clear you can count the stones on the bottom. To share this with a woman of steady heart, that is a prospect that gives this old rancher more hope than he has felt in a very long time." Loretta read the letter 3 times, her breath catching in her throat. The penmanship was elegant, a flowing script that spoke of education and sensitivity. The language was poetic, filled with imagery that painted a vivid picture not just of the land, but of the man. He was no simple farmer. He was a man with a soul, a man who saw beauty and felt deeply. Thus began a correspondence that became the center of Loretta's world. Over the next 6 months, their letters flew back and forth across the continent. She learned of his ranch, the Rocking S, nestled in a valley carved by Cottonwood Creek. He wrote of the scent of pine after a rainstorm, the challenge of the cattle drive, the profound silence of a winter snowfall. He seemed to understand her, without her having to explain. "I know the quiet ache of a life lived for others," he wrote in one letter. "To spend one's days smoothing the paths of others while your own remains untrodden. Here, Loretta, we would walk a path together, every footprint ours." He never sent a photograph claiming a traveling photographer hadn't passed through in years, and that he was no sight for sore eyes in any case. He described himself as tall and weathered by the sun, with hands more accustomed to leather reins than a pen. Loretta found this humble admission endearing. She didn't need a handsome man. She needed a kind one, a partner. And the man in these letters was everything she had ever dreamed of and more. He was intelligent, sensitive, and strong. He was, in a word, perfect. He wrote of loss, but with a gentle sorrow. His wife Sarah had been taken by a fever 3 years prior. He described a profound loneliness, a house that had lost its heart. His words made Loretta's own heart ache in sympathy. She, too, knew that silence, that emptiness. Finally, after months of bearing their souls on paper, the letter she had been praying for arrived. "My dearest Loretta, these letters have become my anchor. The thought of you is the first thing in my mind at dawn, and the last at night. I feel I know your heart as I know my own. But paper and ink are a poor substitute for the real thing. I am a plain-spoken man, so I will be direct. Come to Montana, Loretta. Come be my wife. I have enclosed a ticket for the Northern Pacific Railway to Cottonwood Creek. Sell what you must, pack what you need, and come start our life together. I will be waiting on the platform, a man holding a single wild rose. You will know me and I you. Yours in deepest anticipation, Jebediah." Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down Loretta's face. It was real, all of it. She gave her notice to the Harrington family, who received it with a mixture of surprise and mild inconvenience, as if a familiar piece of furniture had suddenly announced its intention to walk out the door. She sold the few heirlooms she possessed, her mother's silver locket, her father's pocket watch. She packed one large trunk with her practical dresses, her sewing kit, her books, and a small framed photograph of her parents. She wore her best traveling suit, a sensible navy blue wool, and a hat secured with a long pin. The journey was an ordeal. 3 days on a train, surrounded by loud families, wolf men, and crying babies. The air grew thick with coal smoke. The seats became hard and unforgiving. But Loretta barely noticed. She sat pressed against the window, watching as the manicured green of the east gave way to the rolling plains, and then finally to the staggering, majestic upheaval of the Rocky Mountains. This was his land, their land. With every click of the wheels on the track, her old life receded, and her new one drew closer. She would clutch his letters in her valise, rereading the beautiful passages, her stomach fluttering with a nervous excitement she had never known. She was no longer Loretta May Thompson, the invisible governess. She was to be Mrs. Jebediah Stone, a rancher's wife, a woman with a home and a future, a partner to a poet of the plains. As the train slowed, the conductor's voice boomed through the car, Cottonwood Creek. Next stop, Cottonwood Creek. Loretta's heart leaped into her throat. She smoothed her dress, checked her hat in the reflection of the grimy window, and clutched her valise. The train hissed to a stop, a great sighing beast finally at rest. She descended the steep steps onto the wooden platform, her eyes scanning the small crowd. The air was thin and smelled of dust and pine. The sun was brighter here, the sky a more brilliant, aching blue than she had ever seen. There were cowboys in dusty hats, a few women in bonnets, some merchants overseeing the unloading of cargo. Her eyes searched desperately for her sign, for the man from the letters, the one holding a single wild rose. But she saw no one like that. Her gaze swept the platform again, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Perhaps he was late. Perhaps she had missed him. Then she saw it. Not a rose, but a sign. A piece of rough-hewn plank, and on it, painted in crude, blocky letters, was her name, Loretta Thompson. It was being held not by a tall, weathered man, but by a boy of about 10. He had a sullen expression, a thatch of unruly brown hair, and dirt smudges on his cheeks. Standing beside him, clutching his other hand, was a small girl of perhaps 6 or 7, with wide, curious blue eyes and 2 braids the color of straw. They stood there holding the sign, looking utterly lost and alone. Loretta's hopeful smile faltered. She approached them cautiously. Are you here for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The boy nodded, his eyes sizing her up with an unnerving, adult-like scrutiny. He didn't smile. "You Loretta Thompson?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yes, I am." "Pa sent us," the boy stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He pointed a grubby finger toward a buckboard wagon parked near the station. "He said to fetch you." The world seemed to tilt beneath Loretta's feet. Confusion warred with a rising tide of dread. You're Poe? Mr. Stone." "Yep," the boy said. The little girl who had been hiding behind her brother's leg peeked out. "Our pa is Jebediah Stone," she said, her voice small and clear. "Children. He had children. In all those letters, all those poetic, soul-bearing pages, Jebediah Stone had never once mentioned that he was a father. The beautiful, perfect image of her future shattered into a million pieces on that dusty platform under the vast, indifferent Montana sky. The silence on the wagon ride to the rocking S Ranch was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Loretta sat perched on the hard wooden seat, her valise at her feet, and her trunk rattling in the back. The boy, who had introduced himself curtly as Cole, handled the reins with a practiced competence that belied his age. The little girl, Daisy, sat squeezed between them, occasionally stealing shy, wide-eyed glances at Loretta before quickly looking away. Every bump and jolt of the wagon seemed to mock the smooth, poetic prose of the letters. Loretta's mind was a maelstrom of confusion and betrayal. Children. Why would he hide them? Was this some kind of cruel joke? Had she been lured here under false pretenses? Not as a wife, but as an unpaid governess. The beautiful words of his letters now seemed like a calculated, venomous lie. To spend one's days smoothing the paths of others while your own remains untrodden. The irony was so bitter, it made her want to weep. She tried to make conversation to bridge the chasm of silence. "The mountains are quite beautiful," she offered, her voice sounding thin and foreign in the immense quiet. Cole just grunted in response, his eyes fixed on the dusty track ahead. Daisy, however, piped up. "That one's called Sleeping Giant. Pa says it's a giant who fell asleep waiting for his supper." A small smile touched Loretta's lips. "That's a lovely story." "Mama told it to us," Cole said sharply, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. The smile vanished from Loretta's face. Of course, their mother. The woman whose ghost she was apparently expected to replace, a ghost whose existence was intrinsically tied to the two small living beings beside her. The mention of their mother hung in the air, creating a new layer of tension. They passed no other homesteads. The ranch was more isolated than she could have ever imagined. The track wound through foothills covered in sagebrush and ponderosa pine, the creek Cottonwood Creek, she presumed gurgling beside them. It was beautiful, wild, and utterly intimidating. This was not the welcoming landscape of the letters. It was a wilderness that felt like it could swallow a person whole. After nearly an hour, Cole pointed ahead. There it is. Home. The Rocking S Ranch came into view, and Loretta's heart, already bruised, sank a little further. It was not the charming, rustic homestead she had pictured. It was a place of stark function. The main house was a sturdy but unadorned log structure, its wood weathered to a silvery grey. A large barn stood nearby, its paint peeling alongside several corrals and outbuildings. There were no flowers, no welcoming porch swing, just a hard-packed dirt yard where a few chickens pecked listlessly. It was a place of work, of survival, and it bore the unmistakable mark of a household that had been without a woman's touch for a long time. As the wagon pulled to a stop, the front door of the cabin opened. A man stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall, as the letters had said, and broad-shouldered, but there was no wild rose in his hand. His face was deeply tanned and etched with lines of worry and exhaustion. His hair was a sandy brown, and his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, were wary. He was handsome in a rugged, weary sort of way, but he was not the poet she had imagined. This was a man who wrestled with the earth for a living, and the earth was winning. This was Jebediah Stone. He looked at Loretta, then at his children, a flicker of something apprehension, perhaps even guilt in his eyes. He didn't smile. "You got her." Then he said to Cole, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that held none of the elegance of his supposed writing. "Yep," Cole replied, jumping down from the wagon and immediately busying himself with unhitching the horses as if eager to escape the impending confrontation. Jebediah's gaze settled on Loretta. She remained seated, her back ramrod straight, her hands clenched in her lap. The humiliation was a hot flush on her cheeks, to be fetched like a piece of cargo to be presented to this stranger who had so thoroughly deceived her. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice awkward. "Welcome to the Rocking S." Loretta found her voice, and it was colder than she intended. "Mr. Stone, you neglected to mention a few things in your letters." His eyes darted away for a second, to the horizon, to the barn, anywhere but her face. "Reckon I did," he mumbled. "Best come inside. We can talk." He reached up to help her down, but she ignored his hand, gathering her skirts and descending from the wagon with as much dignity as she could muster. She felt the weight of his stare, and for the first time she felt a flicker of something other than betrayal, a grim, defiant anger. She would not be treated like a fool. The inside of the house was dark and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something vaguely sour. It was tidy in a Spartan masculine way, but it was utterly devoid of warmth or comfort. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, surrounded by a few pieces of sturdy, homemade furniture. A long trestle table with benches stood in the center of the main room. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was a shelter, not a home. Daisy ran to her father and clung to his leg, her earlier curiosity replaced by a childish unease. Jebediah placed a large, calloused hand on her head, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Sit, please, Miss Thompson," he said, gesturing to the table. Loretta sat placing her valise beside her. She did not remove her hat. "Mr. Kirkwood." "Stone," she began, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I came 2,000 miles based on the words you wrote to me. Words about partnership, about sharing a life, about a home we would build together. You painted a picture of a life for two people. You failed to include the two most important people who already live in it." He had the decency to look ashamed. He sat opposite her, his large frame seeming to shrink. "It wasn't right," he admitted, his voice low. "I know that. I didn't know how to say it. Women. They hear a man's a widower. With two young'uns they turn and run. I figured if you came, if you saw the place, saw them, you might be willing to give it a chance." His explanation was so boldly practical, so devoid of the romantic sentiment of the letters, that it was like a slap in the face. "So you lied," Loretta said, the words tasting like ash. "You chose to deceive me, to lure me across the country under false pretenses. You didn't want a wife, Mr. Stone. You wanted a housekeeper and a nanny." "No," he said, shaking his head, though his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "I want a wife. I do. It's all tangled up together. The ranch, the children. It's a lot to ask of a woman. And lying about it makes it a more honorable request." She shot back, her anger rising. From the corner of the room, Cole, who had slipped in, silently spoke up. "We don't need her," he said, his young face a mask of resentment. "We do just fine." "Cole, that's enough." Jebediah said, his voice tired but firm. But the boy was relentless. "We don't want a new mama. We already had one." The cruelty of the remark struck Loretta with physical force. She felt the blood drain from her face. This was worse than she could have ever imagined. She wasn't just a prospective bride who had been lied to. She was an unwanted intruder, a usurper in the eyes of a grieving child. She looked from the boy's hostile face to the father's desperate one, and then she thought of the letters, the beautiful flowing script, the poetic turns of phrase. She looked at Jebediah's hands, thick and calloused with dirt, permanently etched into the knuckles, the hands of a rancher, a laborer. Not the hands of a man who could write your letter, arrived like a spring rain after a long, dry winter. A new, sickening realization dawned on her. She looked him directly in the eye, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You didn't write those letters, did you?" Jebediah Stone stared at her, the color draining from his own tanned face. The silence that followed was his confession. The entire foundation of her journey, the very man she had fallen in love with, on paper, was a complete and utter fabrication. He wasn't just a liar. He was a fraud. The confession, when it finally came, was a clumsy, halting thing dragged out of Jebediah Stone piece by painful piece. He sat hunched at the table, a giant of a man, made small by his own deceit. "No, ma'am," he admitted. his gaze fixed on a knot in the wooden tabletop. "I ain't much for words. Never have been." Then Loretta's voice was hollow. She felt strangely detached, as if observing a particularly cruel stage play. "It was Martha," he mumbled. "My sister-in-law. Sarah's sister." The introduction of a new character into this drama did little to soothe Loretta's frayed nerves. "And where is this Martha?" "She lives over in Willow Creek, about a 2-hour ride from here. She comes by a couple of times a week to help out with the children, the house." He sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of the world. "She said a man like me couldn't woo a lady from back east. Said I needed to put my best foot forward. She wrote the ad, and when you answered, she wrote the letters. I'd tell her what to say about the ranch and such, and she'd dress it up." "Dress it up?" Loretta repeated, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. "Mr. Stone, she didn't dress it up. She invented a man who does not exist. A poet, a philosopher. She sold me a bill of goods, and you stood by and let her do it." "I know," he said, finally looking at her. The guilt in his blue eyes was plain, but it was mixed with a stubborn defensiveness. "I needed help. This place, the children. It's too much for one man. Cole's missing school. Daisy. She needs a woman's influence. I thought if you were here, you would see the need. And you might come to care for us. Us." The word hung in the air, a package deal she had never agreed to. Loretta stood up the legs of her chair, scraping loudly against the floorboards. "I need some air," she said, turning on her heel and marching out the door before the tears of rage and humiliation could fall. She walked past the barn, past the corrals, until she reached the bank of the creek. The water rushed over smooth stones, the sound a constant, indifferent murmur. She was trapped. She had sold everything. Her money was nearly gone, spent on the ticket and necessities for her new life. A return journey to Boston was impossible. She was beholden to this stranger, this liar, and his hostile son and silent daughter. She had traded the quiet cage of a governess's life for a wilder, more brutal prison. Her first few days on the rocking S were a study in misery. Loretta was given a small room at the back of the cabin. It was little more than a storage space with a narrow cot, but it had a door she could close, and she clung to that small measure of privacy. The work was relentless, harder than anything she had ever known. It started before dawn and ended long after dusk. Cooking on the wood stove, which had 2 temperatures off, and inferno was a constant battle. Laundry was a back-breaking affair involving a scrub-board lye soap and hauling heavy buckets of water from the creek. The house was a bottomless pit of dirt and dust. Jebediah was a constant, awkward presence. He was a hard worker. She had to grant him that. He was out of the house at first light, and often didn't return until the last of the sun had faded. His attempts at conversation were stilted and practical. "Cattle need new salt lick. Fence down in the north pasture. Might rain tomorrow." There was no poetry, no trace of the sensitive man from the letters. There was only a tired, overwhelmed farmer who looked at her with a mixture of guilt and expectation. Cole was her primary tormentor. He treated her with a cold, simmering disdain that was far more painful than any open outburst. He forgot to tell her the woodpile was low until she was trying to cook supper. He left muddy boots in the middle of her freshly scrubbed floor. He answered her questions with monosyllables and looked through her as if she were a ghost. He was fiercely protective of Daisy, steering the little girl away whenever Loretta tried to engage her. Loretta knew he was grieving, that his hostility was a shield for his pain, but knowing the cause didn't lessen the sting. Daisy was a puzzle. The child was quiet and watchful, her blue eyes, so like her father's, following Loretta's every move. She never spoke directly to Loretta, but Loretta would sometimes find her standing in the doorway of the kitchen, just watching. Once Loretta was mending one of her own dresses and saw Daisy cradling a rag doll whose arm was nearly torn off. Without a word, Loretta held out her hand. Hesitantly, Daisy handed her the doll. Loretta expertly stitched the arm back on, even adding a small patch to the doll's dress. She handed it back to Daisy, who took it, whispered, "Thank you," and immediately ran out of the room. It was the smallest of victories, but Loretta clung to it like a life raft. The infamous Martha arrived on the third day. She rode in on a handsome mare, a basket covered with a checkered cloth on her arm. She was a stout woman in her late 30s, with a pleasant round face and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She swept into the cabin with an air of breezy authority. "Well, here she is," Martha exclaimed, her smile warm and welcoming. She rushed to Loretta and took both her hands. "Loretta, my dear, it is an absolute joy to finally meet the woman I feel I know so well. I am Martha Hemlock." The sheer audacity of it left Loretta speechless. This woman, the architect of her misery, was greeting her like a long-lost friend. "Jeb, you sly dog, you didn't tell me how lovely she was." Martha continued patting Jebediah's arm. She turned her attention to the children. "Cole, Daisy, my darlings, come give your Aunt Martha a hug." The children, who had been sullen and withdrawn, ran to her, their faces lighting up. Martha fussed over them, pulling sweets from her basket and listening to their chatter. She moved about the cabin with an easy familiarity, pointing out things to Loretta. "Now the stove can be tricky, dear. You have to learn its temperament," she'd say with a knowing smile. Or Sarah. "My sweet sister, God rest her soul, always kept the flour in this bin here. It stays drier." Every word was a subtle twist of the knife. Martha was establishing her territory, reminding Loretta that she was the outsider, the replacement. She would praise Loretta's efforts with a faint, condescending air. "Oh, you've scrubbed the floor. How wonderful! It's a terrible task, isn't it? The dust in Montana is just relentless." She made it sound as if Loretta's hard labor were a quaint, amusing hobby. The breaking point came that evening. Martha had stayed for supper, a meal Loretta had painstakingly prepared. The stew was admittedly a little thin, and the biscuits were harder than she would have liked. Martha took a bite and said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "It takes time to get the hang of things out here, dear. Don't you worry. Jeb, do you remember Sarah's stew? She had a secret ingredient, a bit of bacon grease and thyme. The children just loved it." Cole seized the opportunity. "This is watery," he announced, pushing his bowl away. "I miss Mama's stew." Tears pricked at Loretta's eyes. She felt the gazes of everyone at the table on her, Jebediah's helpless shame, Daisy's confusion, Cole's triumph, and worst of all, Martha's pitying, satisfied smile. It was a calculated, public humiliation. That night, after Martha had ridden off and the children were in bed, Loretta found Jebediah on the porch, staring out into the blackness. She stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. "This isn't going to work," she said, her voice flat. "I cannot live in a house where I am constantly being compared to a ghost by the very woman who conspired to bring me here." He didn't look at her. "Martha means well." No, she doesn't. Loretta countered, her voice hardening. She enjoys this. She enjoys my struggle. She brought me here, Mr. Stone, but for what purpose? Not for your happiness, and certainly not for mine. She brought me here to fail. You're wrong. Am I? She challenged. Ask yourself, why didn't she tell me about the children she claims to care for them so deeply? Why would she subject them to the arrival of a complete stranger who had no idea they even existed? It was cruel to me, but it was just as cruel to them. He was silent, the truth of her words sinking in. She wants to control this family. Mr. Stone. Loretta continued, the pieces clicking into place in her mind. She wants to be the indispensable one, the one you and your children rely on. I am a threat to that. She didn't bring me here to be your wife. She brought me here to be a temporary failed experiment that would prove to you that no one but her could ever manage this household. He finally turned to face her, his expression troubled. The idea that Martha, his late wife's sister, the woman who had been his rock, could be so manipulative was clearly something he had never considered. I cannot stay here under these conditions. Loretta said, her voice trembling but firm. I will not be a pawn in her game or a target for your son's anger. You have until the end of the week to provide me with the funds to return to Boston. I will work for my passage until then. But my decision is made. I am leaving. She turned and went back inside, closing the door to her small room with a decisive click. For the first time since arriving, she hadn't reacted with tears or despair, but with an ultimatum. She had drawn a line in the unforgiving Montana dirt, and as she lay on her narrow cot, a sliver of her old self, the resilient, determined governess who had managed unruly children and demanding employers, began to re-emerge. She might have been duped, but she would not be defeated. Loretta's ultimatum hung in the air of the rocking S like the threat of an early frost. The atmosphere grew even more strained. Jebediah was quieter than ever, his face a thundercloud of conflict as he went about his chores. He avoided being alone with Loretta, as if her very presence was a reminder of his failure and her impending departure. Cole, having overheard her declaration, became smugly triumphant, treating her with an insolence that clearly stated, I knew you'd run. You don't belong here. On Thursday, 2 days after her confrontation with Jebediah, Loretta knew she couldn't bear another moment in the suffocating confines of the ranch. She needed supplies from town flour salt, and coffee were running low. But more than that, she needed distance. She needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with resentment and deceit. I'm taking the wagon into Cottonwood Creek, she announced at breakfast, not asking for permission, but stating a fact. Jebediah looked up from his plate, surprised. I can go this afternoon. No, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I will go now. I need to stretch my legs. To her surprise, he didn't argue further. He simply nodded and told her which horse a steady old mare named Betty was best for the trip. The ride to town alone was a strange kind of liberation. For the first time, she could appreciate the stark beauty of the land on her own terms. The sky was a vast, brilliant canvas. The air was crisp and clean. The solitude was a balm. As she guided the wagon into the single dusty street of Cottonwood Creek, she felt a sliver of her own agency return. The town was little more than a wide spot in the road, consisting of a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a livery stable, and a small building that served as both the sheriff's office and the telegraph station. Her first stop was Gable's General Store. The interior was a chaotic wonderland of sights and smells. Barrels of pickles and crackers, stood next to bolts of calico fabric. Shelves were laden with canned goods, tools, patent medicines, and bags of grain. Behind the counter stood a woman with graying hair pinned in a neat bun and a pair of spectacles perched on her nose. Her eyes were kind and sharp. "Good morning," the woman said with a warm smile. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Florence Gable." "Loretta Thompson." Loretta replied, feeling a small measure of relief at the friendly welcome. "I'm staying out at the Rockings." Mrs. Gable's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and her friendly expression became one of intense, though not unkind, curiosity. "Well, I'll be. You're the lady from the adverter." "The whole town's been buzzing. Jeb Stone is a close-mouthed man, but word gets around." Loretta's cheeks flushed. So her arrival was common knowledge, a source of local gossip. "I see." Mrs. Gable seemed to sense her discomfort and leaned forward conspiratorially. "Don't you pay it any mind, dear. It's a small town. A new face is big news." She began gathering the items on Loretta's list. It's about time that man found himself some help. It's been hard on him losing Sarah. And those poor children, especially the boy Cole. He took his mother's passing the hardest. Idolized her, he did. Here was a chance, an opportunity, to learn something beyond the biased narratives of the ranch. "It can't have been easy," Loretta ventured carefully. "Easy, Lord, no." Mrs. Gable scoffed, weighing out a bag of coffee beans. "Jeb just about fell apart when Sarah died. They were a love match, you see. Grew up together, and Martha Hemlock, Sarah's sister, she swooped right in. Been trying to run that family ever since." The shopkeeper lowered her voice. "Some say she fancies herself the next Mrs. Stone, though Jebediah seems blind to it. She's possessive, that one. Thinks those children are hers by right." The words confirmed Loretta's darkest suspicions. Martha's actions weren't born of misguided kindness. They were born of jealousy and a desire for control. "She's a clever woman, Martha is." Mrs. Gable continued, her eyes twinkling with the insight of a seasoned observer of human nature. "Always plays the martyr, the devoted aunt. But she's got a core of iron. You watch yourself around her, Miss Thompson. She'll see you as competition." As Loretta was paying for her goods, the bell above the door chimed. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a silver star pinned to his vest stepped inside. He had a kind, steady gaze. "Morning, Florence," he said, his voice a calm baritone. He tipped his hat to Loretta. "Ma'am." "Sheriff Brody." "This is Miss Loretta Thompson," Mrs. Gable said, making the introduction. "She's the new lady out at the Stone Ranch." Sheriff Brody's expression was harder to read than the shopkeeper's. It was one of professional neutrality, but with a hint of sympathy. "A pleasure, Miss Thompson. Welcome to Cottonwood Creek." "Thank you," Sheriff Loretta replied. "Jeb's a good man," the sheriff said, as if he felt the need to vouch for him. "He's had a rough go of it. That ranch is a tough one to work alone, and with two little ones, well, he's bitten off more than a man can rightly chew." There it was again, that undercurrent of pity for Jebediah, the acknowledgement of his struggle. It chipped away at the edges of Loretta's anger. It was hard to hold on to pure indignation when the whole world seemed to agree that the man who had wronged her was also a victim of circumstance. Her errands complete, Loretta loaded her supplies into the wagon. As she was about to climb aboard, she heard a commotion from further down the street near the livery. It was Cole. He was in a heated argument with a boy slightly older and bigger than him. "And my pa says your pa's so desperate he had to buy a wife from a catalogue," the bigger boy sneered. "Shut up, Harrison Cole," shouted his face red with fury. "She ain't my mother." "Looks like she is now. Your pa got himself a mail-order mama." With a cry of rage, Cole launched himself at the bigger boy. They tumbled into the dusty street, a tangle of flailing limbs and furious shouts. Loretta didn't even think. She ran toward them, her heart pounding. "Stop it! Stop it!" This instant, she yelled, pulling the bigger boy Harrison off of Cole. Harrison scrambled away, laughing. "See your new mamas come to save you," he taunted before running off. Cole was left sitting in the dirt, his lip bleeding, his eyes blazing with a humiliated fury, directed entirely at Loretta. "Why'd you do that?" he spat, scrambling to his feet. "I didn't need your help. You just made it worse. He was bigger than you. He hurt you, I don't care. I'd rather he beat me than have you pretend you're my mother." He shouted the words, echoing in the street. A few passers-by stopped to stare, their faces filled with pity and curiosity. The public spectacle was mortifying, and then, as if summoned by the drama, a buggy rounded the corner. It was Martha Hemlock. She pulled her horse to a halt, her face a perfect mask of concern. "Good heavens, Cole, darling, what happened?" she cried, rushing to the boy's side. She shot Loretta a look of reproach, as if this were entirely her fault. She pulled a clean handkerchief from her reticule and began dabbing at Cole's lip. There, my brave boy." What on earth was all that about Cole, near tears, now buried his face in his aunt's side? They were saying things he mumbled. About her. Martha stroked his hair, glaring at Loretta over the top of his head. "Never you mind them, darling," she cooed. Then she addressed Loretta, her voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "Perhaps it was unwise for you to come to town alone so soon, Miss Thompson. Things can be overwhelming." The implication was clear. Loretta was incompetent, unable to handle even a simple trip to the store without causing a scene. She had been publicly shamed by a child, and then dressed down by her tormentor, all under the watchful eyes of the town. The ride back to the ranch was thick with a new bitter silence. Cole sat as far from her as possible on the wagon seat, refusing to look at her. Loretta's hands trembled on the reins. The humiliation was a physical ache in her chest. This was Martha's true victory. She had not only proven her point to Loretta, but had also demonstrated to Cole and the entire town that Loretta was an outsider, an instigator of trouble, while she was the family's true savior. When they arrived back at the ranch, Loretta unhitched the horse with practiced, numb movements. She knew what she had to do. Fleeing wasn't enough. Running away would be admitting defeat, letting Martha win. The conversation with Mrs. Gable, the fight Martha's calculated intervention, it had all coalesced into a single hard point of clarity in her mind. She would not be run off. She had come here for a life, and while it wasn't the life she was promised, it was the only one she had. The defiance she'd felt on her first day returned. But this time, it wasn't a flare of anger. It was a cold, steady flame. She wouldn't stay for the man in the letters because he didn't exist. She wouldn't even stay for Jebediah. She would stay for herself. She would stay because leaving meant letting Martha Hemlock and a 10-year-old boy dictate the course of her life. She would stay out of sheer, unadulterated pride. And perhaps, just perhaps, she would stay for the little girl with the sad eyes and the broken doll, the one person in this whole sorry affair who had asked for none of it. That evening, when Jebediah came in from the fields looking tired and weary, she was waiting for him. "I'm not leaving," she announced, her voice calm and resolute. He looked at her, confused. "But you said I know what I said. I've changed my mind." She met his gaze directly, and for the first time, he didn't look away. But things are going to be different. This is no longer your house or your late wife's house. From now on, it is our house. I am not your housekeeper. I am your partner in this. You will treat me as such, and you will handle your son. His grief does not give him the right to be cruel. And Martha Hemlock, she is your sister-in-law, and I will be civil. But you will make it clear to her that I am the mistress of this house now. Those are my terms. Jebediah Stone stared at her, a flicker of something new in his eyes. It wasn't guilt or shame. It was a dawning respect. He was looking not at the duped mail-order bride, but at a woman of formidable strength. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, Miss Thompson." He said the name, sounding more formal than ever. "We'll do it your way." Loretta's declaration marked a seismic shift. She woke the next morning not with dread, but with purpose. Her first act was to sew simple curtains for the main room, a small change that softened the harsh light and began to erase the cabin's starkness. Next, she unpacked her books and established a new non-negotiable routine, 2 hours of lessons each morning. "We will start with your letters, Daisy," she said kindly, while turning to a resistant Cole, "and you will practice your grammar. A rancher who cannot keep a clear ledger is a poor rancher indeed." Her practical approach left him little room to argue. While he remained sullen, she saw his guard slip during a reading of Treasure Island. Daisy, meanwhile, blossomed under the focused attention. The true test came with Martha's next visit. She swept in her eyes, immediately catching the new curtains and the children's slates. "Good heavens, Loretta," she said with a dismissive laugh. "This is a ranch, not a Boston finishing school. The boy should be helping his father." Before Loretta could reply, Jebediah spoke from the doorway. "Loretta's right, Martha. The boy needs schooling. She can teach him." The simple statement of support was a shock. Martha, for the first time, was speechless. She had been contradicted, and the power in the household had officially shifted. The ultimate turning point arrived with a violent autumn storm. As wind and freezing rain lashed the cabin, a panicked bleating came from the pen near the barn. The lamb cried, Daisy. Cole knew the pen was prone to flooding. "He'll be swept into the creek," he yelled, grabbing his coat and running into the tempest. Loretta didn't hesitate. She threw on Jebediah's heavy slicker and ran after him. The ground was treacherous mud. She saw Cole reach the pen and grab the terrified animal. But as he turned, his foot slipped and he went down with a cry of pain. "My ankle," he gasped, his face white. The creek, now a raging torrent, was creeping closer. Loretta took charge, her voice sharp and clear above the wind. "Give me the lamb. Now put your arm over my shoulder. Lean on me." He obeyed without question. The journey back was a brutal, mud-slicked struggle, but Loretta's firm grip and steady encouragement got them inside. She barred the door and immediately went to work. With a focused calm that amazed even herself, she cleaned the wound and expertly splinted Cole's badly swollen ankle using rags and pieces of firewood. When Jebediah returned hours later, soaked and exhausted, he found a scene that stopped him cold. A fire roared in the hearth. A pot of stew simmered. Daisy and her lamb were asleep by the fire. And Cole was propped on a bench, his ankle neatly bound, listening as Loretta read to him in a low, steady voice. He looked at Loretta, her hair disheveled and dress stained with mud, and then at his son, who regarded her not with hatred, but with a new, quiet awe. In that moment, Jebediah finally saw the woman he needed all along. Not a poet's muse, but a woman of grit and grace who ran into storms. His voice when he spoke was thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Loretta," he said softly. "Thank you." The storm broke more than just the weather. It shattered the walls of resentment that had defined the rocking S. In its aftermath, a fragile peace settled over the household. Cole's broken ankle confined him to the cabin, making him a captive audience to Loretta's patient care. His enforced stillness stripped him of his defenses. He could no longer flee to the barn. He had to observe, to listen, and to accept her help. Loretta tended to him with a matter-of-fact kindness that demanded nothing in return. Slowly, his sullen silence gave way to grudging answers, then to actual conversation. One afternoon, he corrected her diagram of a horse's bridle, and they shared a brief, fleeting smile. It was a truce declared without words. The dynamic between Loretta and Jebediah also transformed. The awkwardness was replaced by a quiet, mutual respect. He started talking to her, truly talking, sharing worries about the herd, or asking her opinion on a new fence line. He began to see the woman who had brought order and warmth back into his chaotic home. The woman who had saved his son. One evening as they sat on the porch after the children were asleep, the silence between them was finally comfortable. "Sarah planted a garden there," Jebediah said, suddenly pointing to a weedy patch of earth. "Roses. She would have liked you. She was practical. Like you." It was not a comparison, but a memory freely offered as a bridge between his past and his present. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "It ain't her house anymore, Loretta," he said, his voice firm. "It's yours. It's ours." That winter forged them into a unit. The howling winds and deep snow didn't breed resentment. It bound them together. They fell into a partnership more real than any written promise. Love, Loretta realized, wasn't a sudden storm of passion. It was the quiet growth of a ponderosa pine. It was in the way Jebediah brought her coffee in the morning, and the way she saved him the last piece of her pie. It was a love built not on poetry, but on shared hardship and steadfast care. One evening in early spring, as the world outside began to thaw, Jebediah came in from the barn. He stood before Loretta, twisting his hat in his hands like a nervous schoolboy. "Loretta," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "when I asked you to come here, I was a coward and a fool. I offered you a lie because I didn't think the truth of my life was worth anything to a woman like you." He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a raw sincerity she had never seen. "But the truth of my life now is you. You've made this a home again. You've made us a family." He got down on one knee there on the rough-hewn floorboards. He held no ring, no rose, only his honest heart. "I'm not the man from the letters, Loretta. I can't write you poetry, but I will work for you, protect you, and love you for all my days. Loretta May Thompson, will you be my wife? My true wife in all things." Tears of a deep, hard-won joy streamed down Loretta's face. The love she had found wasn't the one she expected. It was better. It was real. "Yes, Jebediah," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Loretta's journey didn't end on that dusty platform. It began there. She went west, expecting a poet, and found a broken man. She was promised a romance, and was handed a responsibility. But in the face of lies and hardship, she discovered a strength she never knew she had. She didn't just survive the West. She tamed her own corner of it, transforming a house of grief into a home of hope and a family of strangers into her own. Her story is a powerful reminder that the life we plan for is rarely the life we get, but sometimes what we find in the wreckage is far more valuable than what we thought we'd lost. The love she built with Jebediah wasn't written in fancy ink. It was carved into the very heart of the frontier, a testament to resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring power of a steady, loving heart. If Loretta's incredible story of courage and resilience touched your heart, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a story of the real Wild West. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell for more true stories of the men and women who shaped America. Thank you for watching.